covering the stories that impact your life, your town, your state, and your future. This is The Means Report with your host, Brad Means.
Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to The Means Report. We appreciate you spending part of your day with us. As always, we wish you the best health and happiness and safety during these uncertain times. But one thing we found is certain during the year 2020, and that is that the political season rolls on regardless of the pandemic. True, we don't know exactly how we're going to vote, but we are learning every single day who the candidates are, and we're finding out more about them on the Means Report each week. And today is certainly no different as we take a look at the U.S. Senate race in Georgia, a race that is capturing the attention of the entire nation as the Democrats try to flip it and as the Republicans try to keep it. Democrat Ed Tarver, well known in these parts, is running for the United States Senate in the Peach State, and we're going to talk to him about several of the key issues today. And I can tell you that Ed Tarver is a former state senator in Georgia and most recently a former U.S. attorney for the Southern District of this state. You probably already know that. He's a longtime community leader, and it is a pleasure to welcome him to the Means Report. Ed Tarver, thank you so much for taking part of your day to be with us.
Thank you, Brad. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. You know, you do have an impressive career both on the civic side and certainly on the political side. I thought after the U.S. attorney job wrapped up that you would just quietly go into private practice and enjoy your life. But no, here you go, jumping into this heated Senate race. Did you just miss politics?
No, it was almost like I was ignoring something, ignoring an obligation. I've always been active in my community, and I've always spoken out when I believe that things should be done differently or when things were being done incorrectly. And after leaving the U.S. Attorney's Office and after the accomplishments we made with the Department of Justice, it seemed like there were so many things going on in the country, and that I had the experience and the talent to step forward and maybe make things better for not only myself and my family, but for the folks across Georgia. So I almost felt compelled to get involved in the process.
President Obama appointed you to the job as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Georgia. President Trump, for all intents and purposes, made it clear that you would not be welcome in that position once he took office. And some people, if you go back to 2017, would say that President Trump handled things too abruptly with the U.S. attorneys across the country, that he wanted out so he could get his folks in. Do you dislike the way that whole thing was handled, and did it leave kind of a bitter taste in your mouth that led to this moment where you thought, you know what, I'm gonna make some huge changes in Georgia?
No, I think it was kind of over dramatized. I mean, we all recognize that every president has a right to make his own political appointments, and we were certainly appointed. I was certainly appointed by President Obama to serve as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Georgia. You know, if there was any regret, it was just all of the attention over the use of the word fired. I mean, you had 93 honorable, very honorable, distinguished individuals from across the country who had served their country faithfully, and they were going to leave, expected to leave, and not be a part of the new administration, and to cast it in a manner where it appeared that they were being cast out for misconduct just seemed to be an inappropriate way to handle it.
Well, one thing you sure did do in the U.S. Attorney's Office is fight crime nonstop. That was your role 24/7. Is that going to be your primary focus if elected to the U.S. Senate, is to continue to be a crime fighter?
Certainly, that would be a priority. But there's so many other issues that we're facing today. You know, certainly healthcare is at the top of the list. Also, nudging out healthcare at the top of the list would probably be, you know, restoring the economy. COVID-19 has created some major challenges for our country, and we have a number of issues to address: the healthcare, the economy, how to restart education, and so fighting crime, criminal justice reform, and civil justice reform will certainly be at the top of the list.
Is the coronavirus pandemic anybody's fault?
No, I don't think it is. I don't think it is. Like all of us, we've seen the reports and the suggestions that China is at blame for what has happened, but it seems like it's had an impact on countries across the globe, and we're all struggling with finding a solution to it. I believe with American ingenuity and the resources that we have in this country that we will at some point identify the appropriate response to COVID-19. But I think that it should be a coordinated response, and that the leadership for how we approach it should come from Washington.
So do you think the response to it right now could be better? Are you disappointed in the way that some of the lawmakers, even the president, have responded to it to try to, as you mentioned a moment ago, get our economy back on track and our country back to normal?
I am disappointed in the response. I expected, like most Americans did, that we would see a more coordinated response. And I also expected that we would see a response that was not cookie cutter, not a one size fits all response. We're so diverse in this country, and each community, each state is so different. To think that we could come up with one solution that's going to have across the board application in every state and in every city and every county just seems unrealistic. And as a result of that, we have mandates that are coming down that our local folks or statewide are struggling to respond to. And so I'd certainly like to see a more flexible response that takes into account the level of infection in a community or in a state, certainly takes into account the resources available in that area of the state or in the area of the community, and then we'll take into account the resources that are not available that may be needed to respond effectively to COVID-19. We see that in Georgia just this week, some schools are reopening with in-person classes. We see others have decided to go to a completely virtual style of education. And there's just a lot of confusion, still reports of students being infected with COVID-19. I would like to see some flexibility, some ingenuity, some step out of the box mentality that would allow us to consider that maybe our schools are not necessarily built, or were not built or designed for social distancing, and if social distancing is going to be the strategy that we use, that we implement right now in order to address COVID-19, that maybe we should identify some facilities like arenas or larger areas that will allow us to put students in a place where they can receive in-person education, but at the same time spread out and social distance and provide as much safety for the students and the teachers as possible.
So do you think we reopened the schools too early? You know, some kids right here in our hometown are back in class as we speak. Was it too soon? And should we have waited, as you mentioned, until the plans and even the venues were ready?
Well, I think that there certainly needed to be more input. In my interaction with Georgians, one of the things I hear most often is the lack of parental input into not only when the schools would reopen, but how they were going to reopen. And then in my communications with educators, a number of them have expressed extreme frustration over the fact that there seemed to be little, if any, consideration given to the health and safety of the teachers, the number of teachers available to implement the various ideas and plans that were put on the table. And I think certainly there's no disagreement that more time would be what's needed, and that if we had taken a little bit more time and had taken the opportunity to accept or receive input from all of the affected parties, that we probably could have come up with a better plan for how and when to restart our schools.
You know, Mr. Tarver, it seems in this day and age there aren't many things that have bipartisan support, but I suspect that keeping our healthcare workers properly protected is something that both parties, all parties, can agree on. How do you feel about the way that our frontline healthcare workers are being treated, and do you think they have the personal protective equipment and other resources that they need during these tough times?
Well, I think clearly, Brad, that initially they did not have the PPE that was needed to respond to the pandemic. Now we've seen that the supply systems have been ramped up, and in most locations, the PPE and the other necessary support is there. But we still see the impact across the state. You know, there are hospitals in Georgia that have announced that they are going to close and likely never to reopen. We have hospitals in larger communities like Athens and I believe Tifton that have indicated that they have exceeded or reached max capacity. And it seems like there are opportunities for greater coordination. And we certainly need to continue to provide our healthcare workers with all of the resources available. I know here locally we had some instances where needed resources, supplies, PPP, and other things that would have helped respond to help our local response to the pandemic were redirected to larger locations like New York and other places. And I think that is something that certainly needs to be discussed. You know, one community shouldn't be pitted against another community in terms of receiving the resources and the equipment that they need to protect the local citizens. And I think that happened in some cases, and that there's not been enough discussion and certainly not been enough actions and regulations put in place to make sure that doesn't happen.
We're talking to Ed Tarver. He's a candidate for U.S. Senate in Georgia, and our conversation with him continues, covering the key issues and the issues that he would like to tackle if elected, when the Means Report continues. Welcome back to the Means Report. We are continuing our coverage of the busy political season as it winds down. November is quickly approaching, as you know. And Ed Tarver is running for U.S. Senate from Georgia. He's our special guest for the whole Means Report today. And Mr. Tarver, I want to talk about police reform and what your thoughts are on that. But first of all, let's just give the viewers an overall feel for your relationship with law enforcement. When you were U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Georgia, you had at your disposal legions of men and women in law enforcement to dispatch, to fight crime, and to help you with your cases that you were building. Do you have a good relationship with them still?
I believe I do. You know, during my 2 terms with the Obama administration, developed strong relationships with law enforcement, both at the federal, state, and local level. And I'm very pleased with the relationships that I was able to build during that period, and I believe I have a good understanding and a full recognition of the challenges that they faced in protecting and serving the citizens of their various communities.
What do you think about some of the images that we've all seen on television, images of the way people have been treated in police custody, the way that some of those apprehensions of suspects have been carried out? What would you like to see done when it comes to police reform, if anything, and how it relates to how officers are trained?
Well, I think training is an important component. I'm not going to suggest by any means that everyone that has put on a uniform is capable of serving, and certainly that they all have served properly. But I will say that one of the things that I would advocate for and what I'd like to see almost immediately is a different mechanism put in place for addressing allegations of policeman misconduct or excessive force. One of the things that I personally experienced was the close relationship that we had with the agencies, the law enforcement agencies that we worked with, and you were right. They helped us a great deal in building the cases that we presented to court for decision. And in cases where one of the law enforcement agencies or one of the officers who was a member of a law enforcement agency that we worked with was accused of some type of misconduct or improper behavior, it was always extremely difficult for our office to also turn around and put on a different hat and be responsible for investigating that agency or that officer's alleged misconduct. And so I think that immediately we should look to some system whereby the local U.S. Attorney's offices, the local district attorney's offices are immediately disqualified in cases where someone is accused of misconduct or accused of engaging in excessive force involving an agency that they routinely work with. I think it's very easy to identify and to bring in some outside experts who are independent and who do not have that close relationship with the accused to make an informed investigation and come to the best decision that they can based upon the facts that are available. And I think if we move to a situation like that, I think it would be better received by the citizens of Georgia. It's just very difficult. If you and I have known each other for a number of years, and it would be very difficult for me to be called in to investigate you. And I can imagine that folks would immediately suspect that there was some type of bias or that I was not impartial. And it just seems like it would be better for all that in cases where somebody that I routinely work with as a U.S. attorney is under suspicion or has been accused of some type of specific inappropriate allegation, that we get someone dispassionate, impartial to come in and to take over that investigation and to proceed with towards a resolution.
You know, speaking of law enforcement and fighting crime, one thing I've noticed, it's been around forever, these robocalls, these calls that you get from people who are trying to scam you or take your money. And I know as a U.S. attorney, you were big on protecting taxpayers and their money from people who would want to steal that. During this age of the coronavirus, I think those scam calls, just from my vantage point, have increased. People trying to take advantage of our fears during these times and take from us. Is there anything you could do in the U.S. Senate, especially with your experience in law enforcement, to stop those folks?
Well, I think there are a number of things that can be done. I mean, clearly we have the technology available to identify where those calls are coming from, and in many cases we can identify who's making the calls. One of the things that I learned as U.S. Attorney is a number of those calls come from outside the United States, come from countries that may not have the relationship between law enforcement that's necessary to actually bring those responsible to justice. But I would certainly will look at providing the resources necessary to law enforcement to not only identify the location of the source of the calls, but also to work with the country from where the calls are being made to make sure that we can apprehend and prosecute those responsible. Because you're right, it's almost turned into an epidemic where folks are just preying on our elderly and preying on individuals who don't really understand the way this process works. And the thing that's probably most frustrating about it is in cases where they're successful, the funds that are stolen or taken from our citizens are in many cases transferred electronically out of the country almost immediately. So it makes it extremely difficult for law enforcement to even be able to recover funds that have been wrongfully taken from our citizens. So I think that certainly more resources need to be identified and allocated for that type of crime. Obviously, you understand that because of the limited resources, certain priorities have to be decided. And in this case, I would certainly suggest that cybercrime, crimes of that nature be included in at least the top 5 of the priority of resources that we allocate for addressing that type of crime.
I'd like to get you to take a look at the farmers in Georgia. It was so painful during this pandemic to see farmers having to destroy their crops, having to dump food because schools were closed, restaurants were closed, nobody was eating it. What would you be able to do, or what do you want to do in the U.S. Senate to make sure that Georgia's farmers are taken care of?
Well, it's a plank on my platform. Obviously, agriculture is the #1 economic driver for our state, and when there is a downturn in agriculture, it affects our state. It affects our state's economy almost immediately, and so we never want to be in a situation where farmers are forced to or put in a position where they're destroying their product and not being able to provide food to Georgians and folks outside of Georgia who need it. In terms of what happens when schools are closed, when restaurants are closed, that's certainly important, and that certainly impacts on the economy. But the biggest thing is that we see now with the long lines at food banks, the increased demand for food assistance from citizens, not only in Georgia, not only across Georgia, but across the country, that it would have been appropriate for our stimulus legislation to have included funding a mechanism whereby that food could have been redistributed, could have been acquired and redistributed more equitably, and certainly distributed to those who were most in need. Our food banks and other social service, community service organizations who have taken on that responsibility for providing that type of food resource to those who need it were overtaxed. They were overburdened with by the sheer demand of what was needed, and I think that we fell short in terms of our response to making sure that that was something that was readily available or could have been readily available to meet an immediate need that we were not able to take advantage of.
Well, a word for our farmers seems like a good place to leave it for now. Ed Tarver, our time, as I knew it would, has flown by, but I really do appreciate you being with us today. It was great to chat with you.
Brad, thank you for having me, and I certainly encourage everybody to engage and participate in the November the 3rd election. I'm looking forward to representing Georgia in the U.S. Senate.
We are about to hit that home stretch. All the best to you on the campaign trail, Mr. Tarver, and thank you for everything.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.